gold, gems, and riches. A dwarf could only dream of gathering a great hoard of these precious items. For many of their kingdoms, the pursuit of treasure would become an obsession, and the dwarven rings of power fueled these desires, and they helped them to obtain more and more riches. But was that all the dwarven rings could do? Or did they have other effects on the dwarfs? And would they have worked differently if they were in the hands of another race such as men? Hey guys, it's Carl here, and in today's episode, we'll be exploring the history and powers of the 7 dwarven rings. So in the year 1500 of the Second Age, the elves of Eregion, led by Celebrimbor, would finally manage to craft the greater rings of power after 300 years of experimentation with the help of Sauron. He shared his knowledge and skills with them, and together they created some marvelous works, such as the 7 dwarven rings and the 9 rings of men. Though Sauron had a devious plan, for these rings were infused with his corruption, and they would enslave their users to his will. Now when the elves learnt of Sauron's deceit, they tried to hide the rings from him, and even though this was a noble act, they didn't have the strength to resist him for long. Sauron would soon lead a great army to Eregion, and he destroyed this fair elven city, massacred its people, and pillaged all of their treasuries and riches. Yet, he couldn't find the dwarven rings of power. Celebrimbor must have hidden these rings from him, and so Sauron tortured him for information, until Celebrimbor could bear it no longer, and he gave up their location. Sauron would soon gather all of the rings of power, apart from the 3 elven rings, and he would offer them to men and dwarfs, for he hoped that he could take advantage of their ambition and greed, and that the rings would eventually corrupt them and enslave them to Sauron's will. It's implied that Sauron chose to give more rings to men than to the dwarfs, because they were much easier to corrupt as a race. Now each of the 7 dwarven rings was given to a dwarven king, and I believe that these kings were the leaders of each of the 7 dwarven houses. There was a very interesting story among the dwarfs of Durin's line, for they believed that their king's ring was the first dwarven ring to be created, and that Celebrimbor himself gave it to their king as a gift, since there was a very strong relationship between the dwarfs of Khazad-dûm and the elves of Eregion. Whether or not the story is true is hard to say, though it's worth mentioning. Now even though we know that the dwarven rings had a different type of gemstone compared to the rings of men, it's possible that their powers were the same, they just had a different effect on dwarfs and men. After all, we know that the dwarven rings could turn their users invisible by transporting them to the Wraith World, and that they also slowed down and prevented the aging process, while enhancing the natural abilities of their user. The problem was that, even though you could kill the dwarfs, or even drive them to madness, it was almost impossible to dominate or enslave them, because their very nature made them extremely resilient, and they would resist the effects of an evil power. And so, many of the powers of the dwarven rings that were associated with Sauron, such as invisibility, turning them into wraiths and dominating them, and even the extended lifespan, had no effect on the dwarfs. Sauron had underestimated the stubborn and resilient nature of the dwarfs, and his plan to corrupt them had failed, and this drove him to hate the dwarfs that held these rings, and he was filled with a burning desire to reclaim them. Now even though the dwarfs managed to avoid many of the harmful effects of these rings, they didn't escape completely unscathed, for the rings enhanced the dwarfs' greed, and it helped them to acquire a tremendous amount of riches. This might not sound too bad, but it would have some malicious effects on the dwarfs, for even though the rings increased their wealth, it seems that it only worked if the dwarfs already had riches and were successful, and when the dwarfs were deprived of these riches, the ring would have such a hold over their heart that it would inflame their desire for gold and precious things, and everything else in their life would seem profitless, and they would be filled with wrath and a desire for vengeance against those who denied them their riches. These rings would also bring many misfortunes upon the dwarven houses, for it is said that at the heart of each of the 7 great treasure hoards of the dwarfs there was a dwarven ring of power, and as we all know, dragons love gold and riches, and they would attack these dwarven kingdoms to steal their wealth. In fact, by the time of Smaug's attack on Erebor, all of these treasure hoards had been plundered by dragons, and 4 of the dwarven rings were lost forever, for they were devoured by the dragons or consumed by their fire, while Sauron had managed to recover 2 of the others. The last of the 7 was that of Durin's line, and it was in the hands of Thror Thorin's grandfather. Tror would lead his people through a very difficult time for his house, for they had just lost their kingdom of Erebor, and they were now a wandering people with no real home. His dwarven ring would also start to grow in power, for Sauron was active once more, and it's possible that it slowly ate away at his mind as he brooded upon the splendor of their ancient home of Moria, until he couldn't resist its call any longer. And so, in the year 2790 of the Third Age, he chose to enter the darkness of Moria, where he was killed by Azog. Before he left, he gave his dwarven ring to his son, Train, and he told him that it may prove to be the foundation of a new fortune, even though that seemed very unlikely in their current situation. By now, many of the dwarves had no idea what happened to this ring, for its possessor would never speak of it or show it, and they only surrendered it when they were very close to death. And so, some of the dwarves believed that the ring was buried in Khazad-dûm, in some secret tomb of the kings, while others thought that Tror had lost it after his foolish choice to enter Moria alone. And this was actually one of the motives that drove Balin to launch his expedition to reclaim Moria, for he hoped to find and recover the last of the dwarven rings buried somewhere in Khazad-dûm. Now Train and Thorin would set up a home in the Blue Mountains, where they did prosper in a certain sense, but the ring didn't help to increase their riches, for they mostly found iron in these mountains, and the ring needed gold to breed gold. There was also a very sinister aspect to this ring, and by now many of the dwarves believed that Sauron knew which dwarf held the last of the 7 dwarven rings, and that it was responsible for many of the tragic events that befell the House of Durin. Even Tolkien said that this was possible, and it doesn't sound too far-fetched. Perhaps it was the ring that drove the dwarves to delve ever deeper for Mithril and Moria until they awoke the Balrog, or what attracted Smaug to Erebor after the ring helped them to obtain a great treasure hoard in this kingdom. It even played a part in Tror's descent into madness, and now it would slowly eat away at Train. For the ring would fill him with restlessness, and the lust for gold consumed his mind, and he wasn't happy with his life. This mad desire for gold would soon become too unbearable, and in the year 2841, Train decided to return to Erebor, even though such an expedition would be fruitless. As soon as he left home, the servants of Sauron would start to hunt him. Wolves would pursue him, orcs would try to ambush him, and evil birds would shadow his path. And all of these got worse the more he traveled to the north, and the closer he got to Sauron's fortress of Dol Guldur. One night, a black rain would drive him to take shelter under the trees of Mirkwood, where he was captured by Sauron's army and taken to his fortress. None of this was a coincidence, and it's clear that it was Sauron's plan to drive him to Mirkwood, so that he could reclaim the last of the dwarven rings. And for the next 5 years, Train would rot away in a dungeon, and nearly all of his mad ravings were about the last of the 7 that was entrusted to him and that he had lost. During the War of the Ring, Sauron would send out a messenger to Erebor, offering friendship to the dwarves in return for information on the Shire and the hobbits. He promised to give them Moria and the 3 dwarven rings of power that remained, if they managed to find the hobbit that held the one ring. None of these rings would survive past the Third Age, for we're told that all of the 7 dwarven rings of power were eventually destroyed, and I imagine that they were consumed by lava after Mount Doom's eruption and the fall of Barad-dûr. How do you guys feel about the dwarven rings of power and the way they affected their users? And how responsible were these rings in the dwarves' tragic history? I suppose that the dwarves were much luckier than men, since they were able to avoid some of the worst effects of these rings, though I feel that these rings indirectly caused untold destruction to the dwarven kingdoms, which is also quite horrible. As always, I'd really like to thank my patrons. You guys really helped to make this channel possible, and I deeply appreciate your support, especially my Wizard tier patrons: Jacob Williams, Michelangelo, T. Gorman, James Stugel, Mike Feeney, Roland Mervold, Jeremy Pontier, and Big Boy. If you too would like to help and support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description. You can also support this channel by checking out our store and by following us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and joining our Discord server. You can find all of these links in the video description. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.